Hi, everyone. So I want to go over our slides on medium, genre, and conventions. And I'm not going to go over everything, but I just want to give you a pretty good overview. Basically, for this project, you're going to need to know these words, be pretty comfortable using them. The first one is medium. And basically what we're talking about here is a method of communication. That's like a really simple way of saying it. Another way of thinking about it that I tend to go toward is thinking about like the materials or tools that we use to make something. So for example, there's a lot of examples here on the side of different types of media that we work with a lot. Print media, like essays, right, that we write for class, reports, magazines, books, mass media. So if we're thinking like radio, TV, magazines, newspapers, magazines again, digital media, things that are published on the internet. So this can include a lot of things, as you know, but like podcasts, videos, social media posts, spoken media, talks, speeches, visual media, paintings, clip art, animations, interactive media, databases, response forums, artistic media, painting, sculpture, music, and movies. Okay. So these are just some examples. There's actually like a lot more. But hopefully this gives you a little bit of an idea of the types of ways that people can communicate and, make art. And speaking of art, I want to talk about medium in terms of art first, because I really, again, it helps me a little bit to think of this in a tangible way. So one of the ways that we could think about this is through art, like what I typically think of when I think of art immediately is paintings. And so I have a classic painting here you probably recognize. This is The Starry Night by Vincent van Gogh. And basically what this is made with, it's oil on canvas. Okay. And so if you go to an art museum and you see there's going to be like a little sign on the wall next to a painting, it'll say who the artist is, when the painting was made, and it'll usually say the medium as well. So this would say oil on canvas next to it. Okay. And so yeah, it's oil paint on a canvas. Now, not all art is this simple though, right? And so some art is going to be sculptural, some is going to be, you know, um, performance art, things like that. There's going to be so many different types of art. One of the ones that I thought of immediately when I was thinking of different kinds of art, different mediums of art was, if you've been to the Phoenix Art Museum, and you've probably seen Kasama's, I don't remember the word, it's typically used, infinity mirrors, something like that room. But it's the title of it is You Who Are Getting Obliterated in the Dancing Swarm of Fireflies, right? And so this is something that's made out of mirrors, on the walls, on the floor, I think is reflective too. It has like Christmas lights, twinkling kind of lights in it. So there's like kind of different materials in there than you would expect potentially from a painting, for example. But I think it's another good example of of something that is considered art, right, within that wide umbrella of a category. But it is made of a different type of medium. And again, we're thinking materials here. And so you might notice too between these two texts that I'm using the word text like really generally, um, that like this is a painting. And the way that I'm experiencing painting is usually by kind of standing somewhat close to it, as close as I can get before the security guards come over to me. And just kind of taking it in, like looking at it, looking at the detail, appreciating the physical, painting, right? If I get to see it in person, I really want to see like the texture of that paint and things like that. Appreciate like how big is it? I have no idea. I've never seen the Starry Night. Actually, that's not true. I think I have seen it. Okay. Um, Whenever I'm in this room, it's there. I've been in there a few different times, and sometimes I kind of walk through quickly, but I'm kind of taking it in. It's like I can feel the lights. There's like vertical strands of lights. They kind of like, you rub against your arm as you're walking through. You might bump into a mirror because it is a little bit disorienting. And so there's going to be like even maybe more of like a physical interaction with this piece, right? And so I wanted to point this out too, because I think that depending on the medium that we're talking about, we might experience it differently. Okay. And so you want to think about that when you're thinking about what kind of medium you might want to use for your text. The next category here, or the next thing we need to talk about is genre. And this one you need to be pretty comfortable with. And so genre is a word that we use, basically just means category. It's a way that we have of sorting different texts. And so, for example, You know, there are the most common places that we see the word genre is with stuff like movies, books, video games. You know, we're sorting them because they're different types of entertainment, right? Or art. And we're trying to think of them in terms of marketing usually, right? How do I sell this to you? And so what we're typically thinking about then is what is the expectation of the consumer or the audience? And then how can I meet those expectations? And then also maybe how can I surprise them a little bit in like a positive way, right? Like, um, and so let's look at some examples here. So one genre that we could talk about is horror, okay, which I think is a pretty distinct genre. When I think of horror, I have a pretty clear idea of what that means. And so I have a movie poster here for The Witch. The Witch is, I don't know, like not necessarily the most traditional horror movie. It is about a witch, right? So that's pretty traditional, but it is, it's pretty quiet, a very slow burn horror movie. Some people say it's not scary, which I don't know if I really agree with it. But maybe it's not scary in the way that you think in terms of like slasher kind of horror movies. It's more scary in like a atmospheric, disturbing kind of a way, right? But then how could we tell that this is a horror movie? You know, because this is again, this is about marketing. So how can we tell that this is a horror movie just by looking at the poster? Well, a few things about it. It's very dark, right? The background is black. Um, there's like not a lot of color on here, very dark. The only stuff that's like standing out, you know, there's the text, right? Which looks pretty like disintegrated, right? Not super clean looking. Uh, it's a little offset, like it looks like um maybe somebody used like stencils or like a really old-fashioned typeset, which makes sense because this is it's a period piece, right? Early America colony. Um, and then there's a goat on it, which is associated with the devil, okay? Or like cults, you know. So there's a few different types of associations here that we could, you know, we could say this might be a horror movie. It also says evil takes many forms, right? So we're getting some hints here. This is a horror movie, but this isn't like the clearest, most obvious horror movie poster I've ever seen. Probably this one is. So this is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie poster. And here we have person holding a chainsaw over his head. He's got a really scary mask on. And then there's like a young girl screaming. She's got really perfect teeth. Um, I don't think that's important. And then there's some skulls over here, right? So skulls, it's blood look, you know, there's blood dripping down her face. It's very red, red text, you know. And then of course up here, if we need a little bit more of a hint, it says the most horrifying motion picture I've ever seen. Horror. Okay, horror movie. But what I want to point out about this is that this is actually a little bit more specific than a horror movie. If I look at this movie poster, I'm not like, okay, this is a horror movie, so it's probably kind of scary. I'm thinking this is a slasher, right? More specific type of horror movie than just horror in that huge umbrella of all the kinds of things that that could mean. So, in other words, I'm looking for a lot of blood, a lot of gore, very violent, probably like a bad guy chasing, you know, teenagers around or like young people. Um, yeah, right? Slasher. Now let's look, you know, let's palette cleanse here. Let's look at another genre, comedy. And so if I'm looking at this movie poster, how can I tell this is a comedy? Well, it's pretty uh it's pretty I don't even know how to describe this. It's not like super symmetrical. It feels a little bit like off center. Um there is you know, some of the facial expressions people are making seem a little bit silly, like she's flexing but she's not like super buff. Um and you know, his face looks funny too. This is a funny face. I don't know, there's some kind of funny faces, facial expressions that people have. Maybe another hint that this is a comedy. It's pretty colorful and bright. Um yeah, so we have a few hints here that this might be a comedy. And then of course, if we're looking for more details, like more specific text details, it also says it's from the producers of Pitch Perfect and Cocaine Bear, both of which I would associate with comedies. And then it says a movie about empowering women, in parentheses, the hot ones. Okay, so that doesn't sound very serious. All right, so again, though, comedy. if I want to get more specific, I can probably start guessing what kind of comedy this is, like maybe a high school comedy, because they're like wearing, I mean, maybe college, but probably high school. Now, here we go, though, subgenre, right? This is a romantic comedy movie poster. And how can I tell that? Well, there is a man and a woman on the poster. Just one man, just one woman. They are gonna get together in the movie, right? And some other details, she's wearing a dress. He's got like a, button-down shirt and it's unbuttoned a little bit and his sleeves are rolled up. There's a champagne bottle with two glasses of champagne. You know, they don't look particularly happy. So I'm going to go ahead and guess enemies to lovers as a trope. And then it says down here, they only look like the perfect couple. Interesting. Okay, so I don't know. Honestly, if I didn't already know this was a romantic comedy, I might also think maybe this is like a kind of like an action, like a Mr. and Mrs. Smith type movie, because like they're not wearing shoes and they look a little disheveled. But I'm pretty sure this is a romantic comedy. I actually haven't seen this movie, but I know that it is, right? Let me know if it is a action movie, and then I'm gonna feel extremely excited to have gotten it so right. Okay. Um, okay, and so I wanted to put together a bunch of different types of movies within the same umbrella category genre. And these are all fantasy, right? And technically not all movies, okay? Because I forgot Game of Thrones is technically a TV show. But these are all movies that would be considered fantasies. But they're all really different. Like this, Lord of the Rings, this is what I would think of as kind of a quintessential fantasy. It's very like, family friendly, elves and wizards and stuff, magic, quest, heroes and villains. The Shape of Water is a fantasy as well. This is much more contemporary fantasy, right? And there's like a monster in it, but it's also like a romance. Game of Thrones, of course, is dueling families. They're all battling for power. It's very violent. There's a lot of sex. It's very adult, right? Spirited Away, animated, of course. And so that's like a pretty key difference compared to, for example, Game of Thrones. Maybe more family friendly, right? Still some violence for sure. But not quite the level of Game of Thrones. If we look up here, this is from The Princess Bride, which is probably a comedy before anything else, and then fantasy. And then finally, Harry Potter, another contemporary one. Spirited Away, also pretty contemporary. Maybe set in like the 90s or something. And Wizards. So that's fantasy magic, right? But otherwise kind of more realistic, like urban fantasy. Okay. So the point here is that these are all in the same big umbrella category, but they're all really different. And so you kind of want to think a little bit when you're thinking about what genre you're making. The more specific you can get, the clearer it's going to be what thing you should be creating, what kinds of expectations your viewers or listeners or readers will have for the text that you're making. And that will help you make choices when creating the text. And so what we're going to next is this idea of conventions. So conventions are going to be a common trait of any genre. And so these are the expectations that a reader, viewer, listener, whatever, has when they're approaching something. When Beyonce says she's going to release a country album, there's a certain expectation that I have for what country music sounds like, right? And so then, I'm listening to the album and I'm thinking, does this sound like country music? What doesn't sound like country music? What does sound like country music? I'm listening for certain things because I have certain expectations. And we see these with horror movies and with romantic comedies. Okay, so let's get into some of these. One of the conventions of a horror movie is the jump scare. And I'm sorry, this is a little bit of a spoiler. I won't tell you what movie this is from. How about that? And so a jump scare is going to happen when somebody jumps out or there's a loud sound or something like that. And then sometimes they're fake, right? Nothing scary's actually happened. It's just like they're tricking you into jumping just to kind of build the suspense. And then sometimes it really is the bad guy jumping out. Okay. Right. But here's what I'll add. Sometimes people will watch a horror movie and they will think it's not scary because they did not have a kind of moment where there was like a loud sound and somebody jumped out, right? So they want to have that like very scary in that second kind of feeling of 1 second where somebody jumps out. Otherwise, like I was saying with The Witch, there's not really, I don't know if there's any jump scares in that movie. There's definitely like things that are visually scary or that sound gross. But I don't know if there's like a loud combination that's like shocking. And so some people don't think it's really very scary. Okay, romantic comedy. One of the things that we look for in a romantic comedy, I think the most obvious one is actually that they get together in the end. And I have a story about that too, but it is kind of a spoiler where my mom, we went and well, we rented a movie back in the day and watched it. And at the end, they don't get together. And she was so furious. Okay. Um, so these are kind of the expectations we have. One is that there will be a meet cute, right? This couple, they meet in some way that seems very promising, but there's something that's going to continue keeping them apart. Okay, so in The Wedding Planner, Matthew McConaughey rescues Jennifer J-Lo when from like a rolling dumpster. And it seems like, wow, there's so many sparks flying. How could these two not get together? Well, he's engaged and she's going to meet with his fiance to start planning his wedding. So they still get together in the end. Spoilers. Okay. One thing to keep in mind throughout all of this, though, is that even though we have expectations for what is going to be in a genre, and especially when we get into subgenres, they do change over time. And they change for lots of different reasons. But I think one of the places that is most notable for seeing ways that genre has changed over time is if we look at Disney princesses. If we look at, pardon me, some of the older Disney princesses, they don't have a whole lot to do, right? They're literally sleeping for a large portion of the movie until a prince comes and kisses them, and then they're awake and have agency again. This is something that hasn't aged super well. Not that these aren't still classics, but I don't know if modern audiences are really interested in this kind of a story. Instead, people are giving princesses swords these days. All right. And there's a lot more specificity to their narratives, to their characters, their identity, all kinds of things that we have that really fill them out as characters, other than just being kind of like pretty and quiet. Okay, I'm not going to talk about the rest of this slideshow much. I just want to tell you that one of the ways that is really helpful for figuring out what the conventions are of a genre is to look at parody. Okay, and so I have several examples of this. And so I'll just kind of move through this really quickly. HBO's The Last of Us. If you watched this is a pretty serious, maybe even like suspenseful drama. Where has sort of zombie characters in it, right? And so pretty specific expectations that we have of that a zombie show. Okay. All right, we're moving on though. We're not gonna watch those. Sorry, Pedro. Okay. Oops. Oh yeah, no wait, that's right. Um so this is an SNL parody of the Last of Us trailer. And it's the Mario Kart trailer. They're doing this parody because both of these are the idea is that these are shows based on video games. The Last of Us, and video games kind of being associated with like kind of being childish, playful, silly. The Last of Us, if you've played it, not a silly, childish video game, but I see where they're coming from. So this is a kind of a serious, dark take on Mario Kart. Pedro Pascal, best SNL guest. And then I just thought it was kind of funny too to compare this to the actual Super Mario Brothers trailer, which is pretty fun, pretty silly, but in an earnest way. Not watching it. We're moving on. No. Okay. Another one that we could look at is Hell's Kitchen. This is a very dramatic reality competition, cooking competition, right? Gordon Ramsay is brutal when he is analyzing people's food, judging their food. And so, of course, that is going to invite parody, oops, in the form here of a Key and Peele sketch, which is a pretty direct parody of that exact show. And you'll notice things like the way that they're imitating the music and things like that to create this like exaggerated emotional roller coaster. Finally, we have sort of boy bands here, right? What Makes You Beautiful by One Direction, a very sincere love song. And then, of course, sincerity is always going to invite parody. So here is a sketch from Inside Amy Schumer called Girl, You Don't Need Makeup, kind of making fun of this boy, making fun of a lot of things about boy bands. There's choreographed dancing in here, which One Direction doesn't have, but other boy bands do, right? So it's just kind of a general parody. But then kind of making fun of the idea of boy bands singing about girls being so beautiful because they don't know they're beautiful, which is just kind of a funny thing. Okay, so when we're looking for conventions, what do we look for? Typically, some things I want you to be thinking about. How are people introduced? How does the podcast, whatever it is, video, etc., start, and how does it end? What do you expect from that type of text, right? Podcast, video, blog. And then how has this show or genre changed over time? Thinking about these kinds of things is going to help you make choices about your own text, and then thinking about how to describe it to me or to the reader in your explanatory essay. I hope this was helpful. Let me know if you have any questions.